Shield swords, feel the boards, fighting my blood, death to the core. Warriors, medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Welcome back to Professor Awesome Minions of Doom. I really hope you heard that because I've been trying to get that thing to work properly. I guess I'll find out through watching it myself later or from your various tweets. If you are interested in participating in the live version that's going on right now, you can tweet at me on Twitter at RSNOKES. That's at RSNokes. You can do the hashtag Prof Awesome. And that you just heard was the new theme song, which was produced by the Wrecking Crew. And at the end of the podcast, we're going to listen to for our outro music. We're going to be listening to a song by one of the members of the Wrecking Crew, Twill Distilled. But for now, let me introduce my guest today, the Swain himself, as he is known. Dr. Larry Swain is a professor at Bemidji State, and he's co-editor of The Heroic Age. And so it's nice to have an awesome professor on Professor Awesome today. How are you doing, Larry?
I'm doing pretty well. How's things down south?
Warm today. Quite warm and quite just hot. It wasn't
pretty
today.
Far north, at least for us.
Okay, so today we've got a set of early texts that we want to talk about. Basically, some of the greatest hits of Anglo-Saxon literature, not counting Beowulf. Next week we'll have just Beowulf. Will be the only one that we'll look at then. And so let's just sort of walk through them and see what you have to say. So we thought we'd do plots badly explained here. So let's start with the first one. The famous Caedmon's Hymn. What is, for those of us who don't know anything about Caedmon's Hymn, what is Caedmon's Hymn? What's it about?
This won't be nearly as good as drug history, but let me give it a whirl here. So Caedmon's a cowherd attached to a monastery, and the habit of the monastery, as you'll find in Beowulf, is to pass the harp around at night after dinner, and everybody provides some form of entertainment with the harp. And Caedmon is not terribly proud of his singing ability, so as the harp is getting closer to him, he sneaks off and goes to bed. After, of course, drinking copious amounts of mead, naturally. And while he's getting ready for bed, an angel appears to him and tells him to sing something, and Caedmon says, I can't sing, and the angel says, sing anyway, and, well, what should I sing about? And sing about creation. And so he sings this song that we now know of as Caedmon's Hymn, after copious amounts of mead.
Right. And so, badly explained, what's the plot of this?
Caedmon gets drunk and sings the song.
The Anglo-Saxons were a simple people.
Exactly. This is pretty basic, as basic as you get.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about Caedmon too is Caedmon is supposed to be Caedmon, like the account is pretty well attested. So Venerable Bede, who records it, he's got this account. Essentially, he's 2 generations off, so he's pretty close to Caedmon. And on the one hand, Caedmon's supposed to be this progenitor of all this Old English poetry that we're going to be looking at today. But on the other hand, it seems really well developed. Like there's this kind of idea that suddenly Anglo-Saxon poetry miraculously appeared in his head in some way. And I think maybe we got a little bit of that, like, we like the rap, the kind of the rap bio where someone has a hard time on the streets, but they have this inborn talent that comes to them. You know, they work their way up. You know, where everything was a struggle for them. We don't like the other stories. And Kevin's one of these stories, right, where it's the you know, I'm just a cow herd, but I'm a cow herd who now miraculously can sing. So you were telling me before the show about the idea of cowboy poetry.
Yes.
Yeah. So how's that play into all this?
I'm from Montana, and between undergraduate and graduate school, there's a short period of time that I worked at a college back in my hometown. And one of my first teaching gigs, I co-taught with a math professor who also was a rancher in the area. And I was deciding to go back to graduate school and was trying to decide where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do when I grew up and all that good stuff. But anyway, so the class was cowboy literature. So we read literature by and about the cowboy life. And of course, we had this big section because at that point in time, Baxter Black was getting really big. So if you listen to NPR in certain areas of the country, this guy named Baxter Black appears on NPR, once a week and recites poetry and talks about stuff. But anyway, so and there was this whole movement that was starting right there in the early '90s, middle '90s, about cowboy poetry and annual get-togethers and prizes and all that. But anyway, so we had a guy who was just an hour or so up the road come into class and do his stuff. He was one of the up-and-comers, was fairly well known in the area for his poetry. And this is all oral, right? These guys just stand up and recite poetry. It's not written down. They don't take notes. So the whole point of this is that it's very, very oral, and a very oral tradition. And they compose it in their heads, usually while they're working. And so one of the poems that he recited, he'd been up, he hadn't even really gone to bed the night before because he'd spent most of the night up calving. There was a cow that had a breech, and so he was saving the calf. Then he drove in and stood up in his work clothes and recited his poetry, and he didn't want to get too close, honestly. Recited his poetry and then answered some questions from the class, and then went on his merry way back to work. But that was about the time that I first started looking at, I was reading Bede's Astoria and looking at Caedmon's Hymn. And so, the two stories of the two cowherds are always, for me, always associated together. Yeah,
Bede tells a pretty kind of clean version of the story. I don't mean clean as in not obscene, but but you don't get the sense of, you know that he sleeps with the cattle, but you don't get the sense of him coming in smelling of cow patties and Yeah,
he doesn't talk about picking up the dung.
Right.
Might be using that word rather than shit. I don't know. I don't know what you want with this. But he doesn't talk about cleaning up after the cattle, or the fact that he's sleeping in the hay.
Right.
Cattle. Yeah, none of that. And of course, he doesn't talk about the kinds of stories that are sung in the hall after everybody's having dinner and they're passing around the harp or any of that. Yeah, so it's really a very cleansed version that Bede likes to tell.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of frustrating too about Caedmon's Hymn is Caedmon is super famous. I mean, it's hard to. I think it's safe to say that of the Anglo-Saxon poets who survive, he is clearly the most famous. I mean, we've got his hymn translated into all these different dialects and that's essentially translated. There's a sense that everybody knows them, that everybody has, knows that they came from Caedmon. But that's all that survived. Like we know he wasn't a one-hit wonder, but his one hit is the only thing that actually survived to today.
Right. Right. I mean, Bede describes him as taking basically the entire salvation history from Genesis to Revelation and turning that into poetry. But none of that is around anymore.
All right. So speaking of,
but that's not his.
What was that?
I said he gets credited with a lot that isn't his.
Yeah,
but
right.
the only thing that survives is that little hymn.
Okay, so speaking of the entire salvation history and poetry and things that Bede did not write, tell us about the Dream of the Rood. For those of you who've never read it, ROOD, not R, which means the cross, not RUDE.
Yeah,
I suppose it could
no
be
included.
Right.
Yeah, so the Dream of the Rood is I think a fascinating poem. It's highly religious, and so that turns a lot of readers off who are not highly religious. But it's a vision poem where the visionary is talking to the cross. And one of the things I love about this poem is it's supposed to be about Christ, but it's not really about Christ. It's really more about the cross. And the other thing that fascinates me is that you have this juxtaposition. It's kind of like a hologram, a visual hologram where, oh, it's a tree. Oh, no, it's a cross. Oh, no, it's a tree, depending on where, you're turning the holographic image. And so in the poem, the poet does a really great job of this, where we're flicking back and forth between this image of this wooden cross that's stained with blood and gore and intestines, crap. And then the next second, no, it's a cross that's, encrusted and covered in gold and encrusted with jewels. And this very rich and ornate thing. And then we switch back to this image of this crude, gore-filled, or gore-covered, I should say, hunk of wood. So, the poet does this really fascinating job in the Old English, especially switching back and forth between those two images. I think it's a really masterful piece for that.
Now, and you mentioned this before, but one of the things about it, which has always struck me, is this is supposed to be the salvation moment, right? This is the big moment in history, and the poet does something really interesting by having the cross tell the story, not having Jesus tell the story, not having some bystander tell the story, but having the cross tell the story. But what ends up turning out is, it almost seems like the cross makes it about, it's all about me. I'm the star of the show. And the cross is, in fact, the only, as an inanimate object, it's the only thing that has no actual stake in the outcome here.
Right. That also is very fascinating, right? And it's even going to, there's that one part of the poem where the cross is actually going to go beat up those who are about ready to crucify Jesus, and Jesus is like, no. So again, it's all about the cross, right?
Right. Well, and there is this whole kind of tough guy, imagery that appeals, I think, to, that really appealed to the Anglo-Saxons, which is this, the cross. Oh, the only reason I didn't go beat him up is Jesus was holding me back, Yeah,
that's right.
Bring
him on.
Right, and the way that Jesus gets on the cross is he's taking his own clothes off. He's going up there and he's grabbing the cross and he's almost wrestling it up. This is not a guy who's tortured to death. This is a guy who's forcing it on the cross, right?
Yeah, which of course is so opposite from what we get in the Gospels.
Right.
Just meekly going to the cross and yes, I could call down thousands of angels out of heaven, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to accept this. And here it's he's wrestling the cross into position and climbing up there. Nobody's doing this to him. It's fascinating stuff.
All right. So speaking of tough guys, or in this case, tough girls. All right, tell me about the poem Judith. Tell me, what is this poem? What is it about?
All right, well, we've skipped ahead chronologically because Dream of the Rood, right, first appears in the 7th century. Caedmon's hymn is late 7th century, early 8th century when it gets written down. So now we're all, we're at 900 or so when this poem gets written about. And Judith is supposedly based on the biblical book of Judith. And I say supposedly because, well, the one scene is kind of in the book of Judith, but the rest of the poem, right, after we get through about the first quarter of the poem, a third of the poem, the rest of it's all made up by the poet. It has nothing to do with the biblical story at all. So basically the essential story is we've got these Assyrians, they're attacking town. Judith chops off the leader of the Assyrians' head after, of course, he's very, very drunk. Copious amounts of meat again. Chops off his head, brings his head back to town, and says, "Okay, look what I've done. You guys go out and kick the army's butt," and they go and do so, and everybody lives happily ever after.
Yeah, and that scene, like clearly, the entire poem is built to get on to the one scene that everyone wants, which is Judith cutting off Holofernes' head. Like that's the important part. In fact, it doesn't matter what the rest of it is, right?
We all want to know about the chopping off of the head.
Right. Yeah, so it's a kind of fan fiction, right? It's here's a biblical story, but I want to get rid of all the other side story. You know, we'll have some of the God stuff in there, but what we really want is to have this girl cutting this guy's head off.
Yep.
Right. And it's nice and gruesome too, right? They're clear like how many chops it takes to get it off, and
how many chops exactly planned. You know, the Fed rolls on the floor. We've got to describe that, and
right.
Yeah, it's great stuff. And of course, one of the great things too is that how they describe Judith, right? I mean, she's hot.
Mm.
I mean, in Anglo-Saxon poetic terms, this woman is just she is the icon of beauty, right? Over against this monstrous guy who's going to rape her, and the poem, unlike the biblical story, is very clear that he's going to rape her. So, and then the fact that she's the one who you know takes his head rather than the other way around is interesting, right?
Yeah, and you know the biblical story is she's kind of the seductress who's going to go in there, you know, and then get him alone so that she can chop his head off.
Right. I mean, the biblical story is very clear. She's got her best clothes on and describes her makeup and her jewelry, and that she lays at his feet and laughs at his jokes and all everything to get him into bed to chop his head off. And the Anglo-Saxon poem is much different than that. She's pure, innocent, and hot, and he's going to rape her, and Judith is going to have none of this, and so waits to the proper moment and off with his head.
And there's this other there's this thing in there which is also the biblical story, as I recall, which is Judith chops his head off, and then she sneaks his head out to prove that she's done it, and then she says, "Hey, you guys need to attack because the leader's head is dead," and they don't want to go. And when they attack the Assyrian troops, they don't want to go wake him up because he's drunk. They don't know he's in there dead because he has this golden fly net or mosquito netting or something to keep the bugs off him. That you could see out, but you can't see in this thing.
Right.
And that is just the oddest detail, it was all the rage among Assyrian noblemen to have this golden fly net, right?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, you can understand it in biblical terms, right? It shows off his power. It shows off his authority. He's got this golden fly net. But in the poem, right, when the poet takes up that detail, he leaves it unexplained.
Yeah.
Just this thing hanging there that he can see out, but you can't see in, but we have no idea what the purpose for this thing is. And the poet doesn't explain it. He just leaves it in there. Whereas in the biblical story, it's explained. We know what it's for.
So basically, his tent is made out of essentially a two-way mirror, right?
Essentially.
You can't see in, right?
I like that.
Right. All right. So
kind of like Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain.
Right. Exactly. But in this case, when Dorothy looks behind the curtain, the wizard's head's chopped off. So, or Dorothy could have chopped the wizard's head off. That would have been another way too.
That would have been better.
Right. I think we
got the Wizard of Oz the way it should have been done.
Right. The Wizard of Oz is Judith fan fiction. All right. So you were telling me in the pre-show about The Wanderer, the poem The Wanderer, and sort of you've got this really cool theory about it. So tell us about The Wanderer and tell us about your theory.
All right. So The Wanderer itself has been called by some people the most beautiful Anglo-Saxon poem there is. As to whether or not taste may differ. But anyway, so the basic idea is this is a poem. The speaker of the poem has lost everything. He's lost his lord in battle, and therefore all the lord's retainers and his army, which also means he's lost his home. And so he is literally the one alone, and that's how the poem kind of starts. The onhaga, right? The solitary one, as it's usually translated. So he's basically just outside of society for whatever reason. And then in the end, he finds some sort of consolation that after he dies, there will be heaven, and God is good and great and all that kind of good stuff. So in a nutshell, that's the 110-line poem, The Wanderer. My theory is that The Wanderer is Tolkien's basis for Aragorn. And for those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, if you go back to the appendices and you read the story of Aragorn before he enters the story, right, he spends a great deal of his adult life wandering from land to land, and never stays too long in one place, and is lordless and homeless, and but is still very much a warrior in the Germanic tradition, just like our wanderer in the poem was. So we can quibble about some details and stuff like that, but I really think that Tolkien, being an Anglo-Saxonist and a professor who taught the wanderer many times to hundreds, not thousands of students, used that as kind of his template for the early life of Aragorn.
And so,
that's my theory.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is interesting because I was thinking about it, and there are all sorts of kind of really similar characters, like these Germanic characters. I was thinking of the Song of the Volsungs, where at some point the characters are just sort of living out in the woods as bandits, raiding and killing people, because the Vikings thought that was heroic. That would be a good thing for our leaders to have been, right?
Well, there's this odd thing in Germanic culture, and I haven't wrapped my head around it yet. But it's a really bad thing to be an outlaw, and yet so many of the heroes are outlaws.
Right. Yeah.
And I haven't quite figured that out yet. But certainly the Volsung family, at least at the beginning of the saga, is exactly that. Beowulf, arguably, his father certainly was an outlaw at one point. That's why he gets to Hrothgar's palace, and Udfirth, another Beowulf character, right? But our wanderer here, we could go on and talk about Hereward the Wake or Robin Hood, right? I mean, they're all outlaws in this tradition, and yet they're the heroes of the tale.
Yeah,
and I haven't wrapped my head around that.
Well, I mean, part of it too is just the, in some ways, the stories of the outlaws are, we like the stories of the outlaws because they can be a little more morally ambiguous, and we don't have to worry about them being bad guys because they're already kind of bad guys.
Right.
Although, to be fair, I don't think we get the sense that the Wanderer is necessarily that he's like necessarily a bandit or anything like that.
Right.
Just sort of in exile.
He's in exile, right? But that's never a good thing.
Well,
I guess that's what.
And his big complaint.
Regardless of the reason that you're in exile, right? Being in exile is never a good thing.
Yeah. His big complaint is not like, he does complain about the weather and things like that, but his big complaint is, I can't be around my friends. I'm all alone here, it reminds me of the attitude I get about myself when my internet's down. My internet's down, and suddenly I've got food and shelter and all the things I need, and I got books. I could entertain myself, but gosh darn it, I am the exile here because my internet has gone down. Speaking of exiles, tell us about the last one we're going to talk about today, The Wife's Lament.
The Wife's Lament, yes. Well, it's a very short poem, and The Wife's Lament, theoretically anyway, the way that it's typically understood is about a woman whose husband is absent, off committing, leading troops perhaps, or whatever. But anyway, so she's and in his absence, she's been rejected by the community. So she is in a way kind of in exile as well, and living out in the woods. And so she's longing for her loved one to come back, and for things to be restored to their proper place. And some people, and I would agree with this, is that she was probably sent as a peace weaver marries this guy. He goes off to, carry on war, and is going to be off for months at a time. And she's left at home as a stranger and a foreigner, and so therefore not accepted by the community at all. And so she becomes an outsider and an exile herself.
So you said she was what's a peace weaver? What is this?
Great question. So in Germanic society, I'm sure you did. So in Germanic society, one of the ways to stop war was to, Lord A's son and Lord B's daughter get married, and so the idea is that because they've now been united in marriage and in blood, and of course this young couple is going to have children, and so they have children in common, that this is going to somehow stop people from fighting each other. Needless to say, as you'll find in Beowulf, it doesn't work so well. But
well, and although the peace weavers are sort of, again, like the bandits, they're sort of idolized as these kind of these figures of great social import, even though in a way they don't necessarily have themselves a particularly, well, I guess it depends. They don't necessarily have the highest rank where they're going. Essentially, what the peace weavers are is they are people who intentionally get the worst in-laws they can possibly get. Their job is, oh, you're our enemies. It's essentially as if we ended the Second World War, by one of the by one of Hitler's relatives marrying Eleanor Roosevelt as a widow or something, and then she would go live in Germany,
and that's going to fix the problem.
Right. And so obviously, even when it stops the war, it kind of stinks for the peace weaver, because she might be married to the king, so she's by marriage has a high social standing. But until the day of their marriage, her family was murdering their family, or at least trying to, and vice versa.
Yeah, and you're talking about some 14-year-old kids who are supposed to keep these warring tribes apart, and keep them from killing each other anymore. That's a big responsibility for a 14-year-old kid.
That is what, especially those who can't even keep their rooms clean, I guess, today. So
I'm not gonna go.
You were talking about how, I don't want to get too far into Beowulf the poem, because we're doing it next week. But you were talking about one of the Beowulf movie adaptations.
Right.
Peace Weavers.
Yeah, so there was, I think it's called Beowulf and Grendel, the one with the guy from the 300, Gerard Butler in it. And there's this character that everybody loves to hate in that movie, played by Sarah Polley, the Canadian actress, who I actually really love. I love Sarah Polley. But anyway, what the blazes is she doing in this movie? People hate the character. It's like, she's innocuous. But I have a theory. And my theory is that the writers of the movie have read other Anglo-Saxon poetry, including the Wife's Lament, and that the reason she really is the Wife's Lament. She was brought there to marry a guy as an Irish slave, and then she marries one of Hrothgar's men, and then he dies in battle somewhere. So now she's an outsider, and she has to live outside the village, and so she lives, out from the community, and wants a better life, et cetera, et cetera. And then along comes Beowulf, another outsider, at least in the movie, and of course, they get it on. And then there's this other outsider. But after
go ahead and spoil it. Tell us who's the other outsider.
Yeah, it's Grendel. So Grendel and Beowulf actually end up sharing Sarah Polley's character. My theory is that it's because they read the Wife's Lament and said, "Hey, this is a cool element. How can we work this in here?" And that's the basis for that character.
So in the Swain's version of this, then, Grendel, Beowulf, is hanging out there in the swamp, and actually, I guess what we find out is this is a kind of version of Caedmon's hymn, where Grendel, he wants to go to the mead hall. Why? Well, because he wants to find women. Is that the idea?
And who doesn't want to find women at the mead hall?
That's right. That's right. That's the best place to find them. Okay. Well, anything else you want to bring up about the text we've been sort of talking about today?
Well, there's so much we could say, but no, I'll leave it at that. I will say though that I really, really want my own theme song now. What can I say?
Well, I'll put it out there to listeners. If you come up with a theme song for the Swain himself, send it in to me, and I'll put it on a future episode.
Excellent.
Yeah. So my guest today has been Professor Larry Swain, Bemidji State, and he's the co-editor of The Heroic Age, which is that The Heroic Age or heroicage.com? Or .org or .net, actually. I don't know where it is exactly.
.org, actually.
.org. I mean, I just start typing it and my browser finishes, so I don't have to.
Right.
I don't actually. No one learns URLs anymore, right?
Well, software and Google will take care of it all.
Right.
Google the only thing.
So one of the things that I wanted to start doing as an outro to the show, which I'm going to start for the first time today with this, is to end with a nerdcore track, and that's how we'll be ending today. The theme song, we don't have the new cover art yet. Hopefully we'll have that by next week. But the theme song was produced by the Wrecking Crew, and one member of the Wrecking Crew is Twill Distilled, so I'll leave you today with one of her with a track called Diva from one of her albums. This one being Planet Twill. So thank you all for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
And you can find this on Bandcamp. Okay, here we go.
Sorry, I'm a DIDA. As a finette, and this is very array. And you can talk dirty, yeah, that's okay. Cause you doing it to my back and that's in the face. I got nothing to hide and I got nothing to lose. Cause that's a big thing, I've been actions. You try to tear me down, but it was never enough. Cause what you got, you're gonna have to trust a repeater. 16 years old, the hell that I live with every day. Hooked on with some resentment. Queen of the East, and I make club president. And I get out all there, living life represent. They consider some chicks in my toes. Cause what they tried to tell me, the actual truth was I had a plan for my life. I was 16, knew where I was going. Now home my mom and dad, you will never make it big. Such a demo was a love it at. Friend like I'm missing you with a home my mom and dad. And the bust of my ass, straight up over on my crap. You want hearing me stronger, and it's really what's happening. No, I'm not also a diva. I got the strength from the swag. Throwing every day, singing in the front and at the back. And I ain't gonna sweat it, got it all in the back. Cause you got nothing, I got it all, you can't take it back. Sorry, I'm a DIDA. As a finette, and print a piece and array. And you can talk dirty, yeah, that's okay. Cause you doing it to my back and that's in the face. I got nothing to hide and I got nothing to lose. Cause that's a big thing, I've been actions. You tried to tear me down, but it was never enough. Cause what you got, you're gonna have to trust a back it up.
Hey, yo,
What up, Dash Clown? Well, thank you. I'm glad somebody gets that. Can you believe these clowns?
They don't understand. They're just not going to get it out.
I don't think they ever are.
We can tell them about it now.
Dash Clown, you should tell them. Spit.
I got you.
Awesome. Take it away, man.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Throw shade at the stealer while the bureaucrats respect the class. Cannot be successful in escape with the rejected cast. Too many homies around me afraid to cause their face. Trying to stay face like Vega, trying to protect his mask. Swell up on you when you say that you won't let it pass. It's like people will view you as death, so it reject mirrors when you show your work in the get where you can best limits and look at the place of success. Slowly I'm jet setting. In college with all of the best letters. I read it as myself a corporate letter like red pepper. Correcting the peak to view me as the exception to every rule about black folks that the Tourette's venom. Sick of me out of my red lessons. Now they learn my name around the country because the music is spread. Catching their minds, keep doing you and keep getting ahead. Letting them know that you're here to stay as a diva who's excelling.
Sorry, I'm a DIDA. As a finette, and print a piece and array. And you can talk dirty, yeah, that's okay. Cause you doing it to my back and that's in the face. I got nothing to hide and I got nothing to lose. Cause that's a big thing, I've been actions. You tried to tear me down, but it was never enough. Cause what you got, you're gonna have to trust a repeat it.
Oh, yeah.